We've created this video to guide you through the successful completion of the element assessment assignments. The element assessment assignments are a series of assignments designed to help you focus on the building blocks of communication, which are at the elemental level. When you consider how we can deconstruct marketing communication from modes to platforms to communication formats and finally to design elements, this illustrates the importance of understanding how particular communication design elements play their roles in helping marketers to inform, remind, persuade, and connect. Remember that those are the four main purposes of marketing communication, but there are a number of other ones as well. There's a tendency for marketers to consider marketing communications from a conceptual level and from an even higher meaning level, but they tend to bypass a strong assessment at the element level. This assignment series will help you to strengthen your ability to assess marketing communications at the elemental level. It also will help you learn to communicate using terms that your members of your creative team will understand and appreciate. Finally, it'll broaden your knowledge of how particular uses or portrayals of communication elements can impact the effectiveness of your marketing communications, regardless of whether those communications are in visual, auditory, or other formats. The power of design elements is significant in marketing. We can use design elements to initiate contact, getting people's attention. We can use it to maintain contact or retain attention. We can direct attention toward or away a certain part of a message. We can help use design elements to help commit particular information to memory for later retrieval. We can use it to spur memory and get people to remember something. We can use it to evoke emotion, whether it's positive, negative, or neutral emotion. We can use it to persuade or influence or sway or nudge people in certain directions. We can use it to communicate facts, convey meaning, build connections, tell stories, and support other communication formats. We can also use it to detract from other formats. For example, you may use music to detract people away from a visual, or use music to help them understand the visual even better. And finally, we can use design elements to distract the message recipient into focusing on one part of something and distract them away from the other part of the message. This assignment series ends up being one assignment for each of the 8 communication formats of static or unmoving imagery. This basically means like a print ad. Dynamic video imagery, which is just a matter of looking at video. Moving imagery. Music. Static or unmoving text. Dynamic, moving text. Speaking. Our other category is not visual or auditory. So it can be touch, taste, smell, proximity, anything that's not directly visual or auditory. And finally, the last category is silence or nothingness or emptiness. For each element assessment, you'll need to have an element-focused description, an element-focused evaluation, and an element-focused set of recommendations. Let's discuss the element-focused description first. For each of the element assessments that you'll do, you'll take a look at a particular ad or marketing communication piece, and you'll provide a detailed description of the focal communication format. That could be video imagery, it could be music or speaking or moving text, whichever one you're focusing on for that particular assignment. And you have to do this description in terms of the format's design elements that are found within that particular ad or communication piece. When you do this element-focused description, you have to stay focused at the design element level. Don't talk about concept, don't talk about meaning, but focus only on the design elements. You also have to stay focused on the focal communication format. This means that if you're looking at video imagery, for example, in the assignment, then you're not going to describe the music or the speaking or moving text. If you're focusing on the music, for example, then you wouldn't talk about any speaking or video imagery. The idea is to focus only on the design elements for that particular communication format that you're focusing on for that particular assignment. Finally, do not evaluate or recommend in this section. The description section is only to describe, and you have to wait until the evaluation section and recommendation section in order to evaluate and make recommendations. Let's go through an example of a print ad, obviously a very, very old print ad, where we can take a look at this and try to think of how we might be able to use various design elements in order to describe this ad. So for this particular ad, maybe you would decide to focus on a design element such as looking at the background and how the background has a contrast versus the foreground. So in this particular ad, you don't see any background per se, and it's just a white background with the people in the foreground. Maybe instead you'll look at something like the design element of looking at the tonality of the colors. They're fairly muted colors, fairly common for that time period, but they're definitely different than what we might see today. Maybe instead you might take a look at the flow or the visual hierarchy of information. What do you see first? Maybe you look at the visual texture of the woman's clothing and the man's clothing, and then the texture of the other items that are in there. Maybe you consider the idea of pointing elements or building with shapes. There are all sorts of different ways you can look at this. Now you might decide to consider how the eye flows and the flow of direction of your eyes, and think that you might start up where the man is looking downward, where he's passing the record to the woman, and then perhaps even move that flow even a little bit further. So consider, for example, this flow that might go from him leaning over through the record down all the way to the Pepsi Cola logo that's on the bottle cap at the bottom. So, and these really are up to you and what you see in this particular ad or communication piece. It's your view of this, and you're going to try to talk about this description. Now, you're not going to evaluate whether it's good or bad in this section. You're only describing. You might also talk about framing, for example, and notice how there tends to be a little bit of a triangular frame here, where inside of that is this set of text and also the Pepsi bottles down at the bottom. It's up to you to decide which elements you're going to use and how you're going to describe the ad. Now remember, you wouldn't necessarily talk about what's in that text, because that's a different type of an assessment that we're going to do later on with static text. But what you could do is mention that the text is there and mention what it is that's being framed in this triangle. You might also discuss, for example, the yellow mark underneath the word light, and how that yellow perhaps is related to the yellow down here that's surrounding the Pepsi Cola bottle cap and logo. You're not necessarily, again, at this stage, going to evaluate whether you think it's good or bad or effective or not effective, but you can at least point out certain elements of design and talk about them from a descriptive perspective. You might also look at the idea that there's some framing that's going on here as well, that is framed by us not letting this image bleed off the page, but there's that frame at the top and also on the left side where we've now limited how much of this image is actually going to go to the edge, and also limited where our eyes will go. Now let's say instead of looking at visual imagery, we were actually working on the element assessment using the format of static text. In this case, we might decide to look at this section of the text at the top, where it says, "Enjoy the modern light refreshment." So we could talk there about how this is set off apart from the other text. We could mention how this word light is in very light font. In other words, it seems like it's not as heavy as the other font, and so they're trying to kind of illustrate that to us through the type of font that they're using. It's also underlined. It kind of looks like it might be floating. And so the idea here again is to describe and not necessarily get to the point of evaluating. There's a similar font down at the bottom where it says refreshes without filling. So again, it looks like that light kind of a font, which would give you the idea that it's not going to be filling. There are a number of things you could do as well with the text that's in the middle. So you could look at that text, which actually says here on the side, she knows that Slim Beauty depends on eating habits, and so she makes lighter, less filling food in a drink a pleasant daily rule. Today's Pepsi Cola, reduced in calories, goes right along with the sensible trend in diet. Never heavy, never too sweet. It refreshes without filling. Go on record for light refreshment, say Pepsi please. And the word light there is in italics, which again gives some focus. And also this will help you with your next section, because as you look at the information there, it will help you to understand what are they trying to accomplish with this particular ad. So as you look at the various parts of this, then you can go on and work a little bit more on the element-focused evaluation. So for the element-focused evaluation, first you have to make sure to provide the context of your evaluation by stating what you feel is the general purpose of the ad or the communication, as well as the specific marketing goals. So you need to make sure you do this prior to actually evaluating. You can't evaluate if you don't have the context of what's the general purpose of the ad and what are the specific marketing goals. Again, these are the marketing goals from your perspective. Then you can evaluate the effectiveness of how each element is used in the ad. In other words, does each ad or each element as it's portrayed help or hinder the achievement of the goals? And so whenever you're doing this evaluation, you have to do it in context of the goals or the target audiences, the brand image, the concepts of cognition and emotion, whatever it is. You always have to do the evaluations in context. Finally, for the element-focused recommendations, you can ask this question: how could or should the specific design elements in the ad or communication be redesigned to improve the effectiveness? You can focus your recommendations again on the design elements that you've already described and evaluated. And you can consider how the portrayal or use of each design element could be redesigned to help with perhaps attention or delivery or message retention or emotion, direction, persuasion. The idea is to think of what you could do to make it better. Now, if you have an ad that you feel for some reason is perfect, which I promise you is highly doubtful, you could at the very least discuss how design elements could be changed to reach a new target audience. You have to make sure with the recommendations that you have at least 2 recommendations. Now, we've also providing you with a template. A template is helping you as a guide to ensure that you cover all of the required parts of the assessment. That would be the element-focused description, the statement of purpose and goals, the element-focused evaluation, and the element-focused recommendations. Now, you don't have to use the template necessarily. You're welcome to present your assessment or your assignment in another manner if you feel like it's going to be more helpful in communicating your work to the professors, but you can use a template if you would like to. Also, try to open up and not be constrained so much, and try to explore alternative design elements. And what I mean by this is that explore the idea of taking design elements normally associated with one particular communication format and then use those design elements to describe and then later to evaluate another communication format. For example, you could use visual design elements like symmetry or alignment or pointed or flow or containment or repetition, depth, contrast to describe the communication formats of music or speaking. Or alternatively, you could use typical music elements like tonality and rhythm and dynamics and timbre and tempo to describe static or dynamic imagery. You could maybe use non-visual and non-auditory elements such as pressure or softness or sweet or bitter or pungent or aromatic to describe music or imagery or speaking or writing. So really, this is when you're doing this assignment, try to remember these three things. Don't limit yourself, escape from your comfort zone, and go ahead and be a little bit uncomfortable and enjoy the moment. It really is an interesting set of assignments. They're not necessarily hard to do, but they will take a little bit of effort and time to get into that ad and try to understand it clearly.